We are all set once again, and um, Shaurit is already present. Let me introduce Shaurit. Shaurit Bhattacharya is lecturer in postcolonial studies at the University of Glasgow. His research interests include postcolonial literatures, eco-criticism, translation studies, Marxism, and literary form. His works in these areas are either published or forthcoming in such journals as Ariel, Textual Practice, Interventions, Edition, and in edited books such as Cambridge Critical Concepts, Magic Realism, Aesthetic Political, Politics of Global Hunger, and others. His first work, titled Postcolonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, was published online last month. Shaurit is a founding co-editor of Shangla, Journal of Literature. Now I request Shaurit to carry on present his paper. And at the same time, I would like to thank the viewers who are with us on the page. I thank you once again, and I request Dr. Shaurit Bhattacharya to present his paper.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mondol. Am I audible? Can you hear me properly?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear.
Yes, because the sound is coming to me a little bit broken from your side. So I'm not very sure if you're getting my words clearly.
No, you are audible. You are completely audible.
Okay, all right. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Mondol, for the introduction. Thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Mondol and Dr. Kormukar, for allowing me to speak, having me here today. And at the same time, although virtually, of course, at the same time, also my sincere thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dipak Kumar Kar, and Professor Aparajita Hajra, Head of the Department of English. So thank you so much for organizing this webinar. I heard lectures yesterday. Today it was a bit of work, and because it's a weekday, so I couldn't manage it. But of course, like I'm also looking forward to your next day. So one thing before I start, I just wanted to make sure that if you have a question or a comment, keep them with you till the end, and or the best option could be that you could write your questions and comments in the chat box so that once the lecture is over, I can get back to them if you have any, not necessary. So my paper, the presentation is titled Post-colonial Toxicity and the Ecogothic, Nabarun Bhattacharya's Khelnanagar or Toxicity. Now, there is one thing I wanted to make sure that first of all, there are two key terms in this particular, the first part of the paper, or the title of it, post-colonial toxicity and the eco-gothic. So what I will do in the first part of the talk is to explain the terms that I have used here in the main title and how they're related with post-colonialism. At the same time, the life and the reality that we go through on a daily basis, and how writers and artists have tried to represent them in literature. Now, this is difficult for something like toxicity or something like, let's say malnutrition, something we on a daily basis are not being able to see. Certain things which we do not see are very difficult to represent in art. How do you represent them? Things that we cannot see. So it is not that it is not happening. It's just that the way we see and the way we cognize or recognize, these two things are not happening in a symmetrical fashion. I can see that, for instance, toxic drift or something happening in the manner of, let's say starvation or malnutrition. We know that this is happening. We get the data, we get the facts, and we try to help whatever we can do, but that doesn't reduce or take the numbers down. And that's the and to bring it back, how do we write? And I in my PhD thesis and in my first book that came out last month in an online fashion, in an online version, was that the way we see things, sometimes when we define or try to represent, let's say, a famine, what happens is more often we see that the famine, that the writers are being like representing it in such a way that it becomes um, either sensational or melodramatic. These are not my words. These are like words of critics who have, let's say, written reviews of these books when they came out in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the 1943 famine. I mean, only if you, some of you may remember that one of the most artistically satisfactory novels to come out of this particular time, artistically satisfactory, again, not my word, critical use of it, is Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's novel Oshoni Sanket, or the ominous R, or something like that, sign, ominous signal. So that is because the famine is not there in the novel. The moment it is there in the novel, in another novel, let's say Nabarun Bhattacharya's So Many Hungers, there is no other way but to show them the dead bodies and the lives and the death by almost like starvation. That's a term that uses that an anthropologist uses, death by starvation. So this becomes more sensational, more melodramatic, very difficult. Think about some of the images that have come out from the recent cyclone in the southern parts of Bengal, especially from Sundarban. I mean, the immediate response is very much affective, very emotionally charged. And when we write about that emotion, the writing also takes up very strongly affective emotion. It doesn't mean that later writings do not have that kind of affect in them. It's just that writing within the very corpus, within the body, within the very, let's say, the space of the disaster, in a way, would be something like writing with much more immediacy and much more bodily connection. Writing afterwards becomes like looking back, something which in the Holocaust studies called transgenerational or third generation sort of memory. Now, to come back to the topic, post-colonial toxicity, this is the precise problem that we, I'm sure, like literary writers also go through, precisely because there is so less writing about toxic matters or about toxicity in general. How many novels or how many literary works you remember are based on these things, such as toxicity or such as, let's say, even an epidemic? Today, the same thing happens when we try to cognize what is happening today globally, the coronavirus, which cannot be seen, but at the same time, we know that it is lethal. So this is the thing that I would like to talk about in this lecture, that how do we frame into aesthetic modes certain forms of violence or disasters that cannot be palpably seen or touched or understood. Now, this is a problem, but at the same time, probably as a literary critic, I can say that. But as a writer, of course, the writers, there is an imperative, there's an urgency to write about these things. Now, in the same way that a literary critic or a historian have the urgency to document, to talk about these things. So this is the particular mode or particular entry point that I have into this essay or into this lecture. So post-colonial toxicity. Before that, I would like to say that post-colonial toxicity toxicity as a mode of or as a mode of, let's say, life is, or as a literary critic, an object of study, comes from broadly a field or a subfield called post-colonial eco-criticism. Now, eco-criticism goes far back. So does post-colonial studies, as when they started building their fields. So, in a sense, in the last 2 decades, so to say, or in the last decade mostly, that ecological and environmental aspects have become key to studying post-colonial theories or post-colonial sociological conditions, so to say, or post-colonial literature and art. Now, I do not want to go much into post-colonial eco-criticism here because that's not the part of the topic. But let me give you just one quote from Graham Hagan and Helen Tiffin, who have written a book called Postcolonial Eco-Criticism, a very widely discussed and a very important book, I think, in this particular field or subfield, however you put it. So what have they written in their introduction? So that probably will situate my gambit, my kind of entry point into this. So they write, postcolonial studies has come to understand environmental issues not only as central to the projects of European conquest and global domination, but also as inherent in the ideologies of imperialism and racism on which those projects historically and persistently depend. Not only were other people often regarded as part of nature and thus treated instrumentally as animals, but also they were forced or co opted over time into Western views of the environment, thereby rendering cultural and environmental restitution difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Once invasion and settlement had been accomplished, or at least once administrative structures had been set up, the environmental impacts of Western attitudes to human being in the world were facilitated or reinforced by the deliberate or accidental transport of animals, plants, and peoples throughout the European empires, instigating widespread ecosystem change under conspicuously unequal power regimes. So after a while, from here, they write, again I quote, postcolonial eco-criticism preserves the aesthetic function of the literary text while drawing attention to its social and political usefulness. Its capacity to set out symbolic guidelines for the material transformation of the world. To that extent, it can be seen as an interventionist or even activist enterprise. Now, this is a long quote. The point that the both of them are using is that it is impossible to talk about post-colonialism without talking about some of the ecological or environmental conditions which have been key to build either an imperialist empire or what we know today as the repercussions of the industrial revolution. If you do not take out those raw materials from some of the peripheries and the colonies, then the engine of the empire won't run, even if it is set in metropolitan cities or sort of core countries, so to say, or even if they are something different, even if they are in, let's say, the peripheral countries. The point here that both of them make is that this is a 2009, and then sort of 2006 onwards, they have been writing about it. And then from 2010, this is, I think 2010, 9 or 10, that when this book comes out. So this is precisely the moment where post-colonial eco-criticism as a new field sort of is widely sort of discussed and kind of worked upon. And then now from the last decade or so, I think more work of interesting nature, which may not use the terms colonial, post-colonial, or imperialist, but definitely have worked upon or drawn upon some of these discussions. So this is in this particular sort of, let's say, subfield that toxicity or toxic elements, how societies and real lives are impacted by these factors, by these aspects, they come into the fold of literary studies. So what I want to show here is that how is it that toxic elements or dumping toxic and radioactive elements has a post-colonial meaning in it? What is post-colonial about toxicity? Let's start with an understanding that toxic, anything that has the possibility of harming you and a whole species and a whole locality, the full spectrum of species and the locality is toxic. That it may come from the chemical or the radioactive wastes, or it may come from plastic, it may come from huge amount of dumping being done in an unsustainable fashion, or even done in a very incoherent fashion. So anything that has a long-term impact on human life. So the quick one I could think about is the Bhopal gas disaster in 1984. That's like 30, almost like 36, something like that, years ago. And even then, even today, there are children born with terrible conditions, respiratory problems, physical ailments, etc. There is a social justice that is a campaign that is still going on. So the point being that almost like in a sense, the long-term impact of something done previously, much previously. Now, this is the problem that we'll talk about in literature. Like, how does literature, deal with these problems? Something that happened like years ago, and then the impact is slowly being shown 2 or 3 decades later. Now, this is the toxicity part. Let me give you a couple of examples from from the newspaper The Guardian, and what they sort of wrote. I think it is in March 2019. This is the two reports come out in March 2019. I'll just give you these quick examples. So I'll read out this section. In May 2019, this is not March, in May 2019, a news report in The Guardian went viral on social media that Southeast Asia had decided to return mountains of toxic and waste materials to the North American, European, and first world countries. Uh, so Hannah Ellis Patterson wrote it. The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, threatened to sever diplomatic ties with Canada if the latter did not vow to take back its waste routed to the Philippines. In another report of around the same time, Malaysia spoke of sending back thousands of tons of plastic waste to Australia. Malaysia's environmental minister, Yowie Yin, declared that Malaysia would not be treated as, quote unquote, a dumping ground of the world, also in The Guardian. Now, these declarations came in the backdrop of the recent Gaia meeting of Southeast Asian leaders, where the severe national health and economic problems conditioned by plastic and toxic waste from the West, such as crop death, contamination of water, respiratory issues, and others, were brought to critical purview. As India declared in March 2019 that it wouldn't import plastic any longer from the West for recycling, a report in The Independent, another newspaper from Britain, read that it had thus become difficult for the developed first world nations to find suitable alternatives for dumping their toxic materials. This is something which was written by Phil Cockburn, 2019. Now, what I mean to say by giving you this sort of very recent news reports about how some of the first world nations, so let's say first world, or let's say fully developed nations, are sort of dumping some of their toxic materials. Of course, the language is very straightforward here. I don't want to get into what is the international politics going there, but of course, there is a clear sign that there is a power game going there about how certain nations and countries can actually manage to send their waste in short to certain other countries because of a certain form of power dynamics, and that certain form of power dynamics comes 300 has a 3 or a 400-year long or a 500-year long sort of politics behind them, of course, right? The politics of colonialism and world imperialism. Now, this the point that here comes again is that, so while the global south, if I use this sort of broad term as the global south, while the global south as the developed, read the colonizing and imperialist world's dumping ground, has strong connotations of world colonialism and imperialism, the ground for the current situation, however, began more specifically in the mid-1970s. So Jennifer Clapp, in a book, she tells us that from the early 1980s, it became, and I quote her, became apparent that hazardous wastes generated in industrialized countries were being shipped to developed countries for final disposal. So I don't want to get into, there is a huge link between waste disposal and International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and some of the structural adjustment schemes. That's the politics going behind sending that, but and that's also a politics that allows certain nations to have more legitimacy to their voice, to their concerns than certain others. Now, this is, think about that. This is a more global, international scale. I'm thinking about now about, let's say, what does then India do? Does it produces a lot of toxic and radioactive, and because there are plenty of industries. Now, what happens there? I don't have to even think about that in this way, that, okay, it's like Britain or Canada or somebody else is sending toxic waste. Of course, India is producing a lot of the waste, and this toxic waste is either being dumped in the most of the times it will be the peripheral, the marginal, the less habitational, of course, because everybody's health is important. But these are the places where, but it is not that these are places where there is no ecosystem. There might be like local habitations going on there. Certain things, certain people are more important than certain other people. How many times have we realized this? So this is the thing that is going on there. And I just wanted to show you a quick so this came out. I was just a minute, please. I was just going through this recently again to just tell another person that what is happening. So think about what happened just a month ago in Vizag, where there was a chemical disaster, and we are still. I mean, that was a very stressful sight. And then after that, we saw again. I think it is yesterday, a chemical disaster in Mumbai. These some of these things will go on for some time. But this down to earth article, down to earth is a magazine, is also sort of, let's say, very influential and published from India. So they talked about one after another. I can send you the link later if you can find out yourself. That's even better. Is that one after another in the last sort of article was published in 2015 June, where they said that you don't have to think about Western nations. Think about how many we are dumping. Plenty of cities in the same time, around the same time. That 4 or 5 examples were given where things have become out of hand. People have died because of, and people have started showing bluish, greenish dabs on their skin. And this is where the sort of protests began about that. And I think a few years, maybe a year or two back, this was there in Chennai, or I don't remember exactly where. The Starlight had a similar sort of a situation, the Starlight industry. So point being, this is a reality. What I mean to say is that it is not that only some of the nations are doing it. Everybody, whoever wants to industrialize, will have those waste. The problem is how to deal with that waste. So that is where we keep mountains of waste outside of our own local habitation, the impact of which goes on to our generation after generation. So this is the particular thing I wanted to give you, that our reality is very much in urban or even semi-urban or rural lives are so much associated, conditioned by how we manage waste, or how we manage or sort of get impacted by toxicity and toxic materials coming out from that waste in our breathing or respiratory conditions. So this is the first part of post-colonial toxicity. So the eco-gothic is, so this is something that I wanted to have you an understanding about, is that post-colonial, in most cases, what happens is, this is the problem that post-colonial literature faces. That, as I said in the beginning, how do I represent that? Can I just show a mountain of toxic waste and how it is? Can I show it in the novel form? Can I show it in not in the photographic form? What will be the form and the genre? And this is something that recently a group of literary critics have started talking about that, more influentially by Rob Nixon, who has written a book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor and Environmentalism of the Poor. So this book deals with a particular topic, a particular sort of keyword, let's say slow violence. Again, it comes through the concept of, in slow violence, Nixon sort of groups a lot of the things like toxic drift being one of them, and things that we cannot see. So the things that we can see and respond very strongly, such as an earthquake or even the flood in the Sundarbans, these are something he calls spectacular violence, like things that will automatically will demand a lot of media and public outrage, or maybe like sort of the focalization of it. But again, coronavirus, what do you see? We don't see anything. So what we see is that people panicking, or people like people are sort of beating people, or people are doing something stupid. So this is if you bring it into art form, maybe this is the thing that we could do it. So what Rob Nixon says is that we need to give, and he uses the term, figurative forms to formless violence which is formless, violence which is probably even not temporarily locked in a certain time period. So this is something it tries sort of constantly talks about. So what one of the ways that literature does give form to a formless violence is the use of the eco-gothic. Now again, eco-gothic is a relatively new term. sort of combination of ecological and Gothic. Many of you may know already that the Gothic deals with horror and romance in periodic or enclosed settings where supernatural events and characters abound. It is precisely because of this um, sort of condition of being of Gothic that its link with ecology and nature has been widely discussed already. So in a volume devoted to exploring the link, Andrew Smith and William Hughes in 2015 in a book, they note the emerging critical focus of the eco-Gothic in the context of drastic climate change and environmental anxiety. Gothic seems to be the form which is well placed to capture these anxieties and provides a culturally significant point of contact between literary criticism, eco-critical theory, and political process. This is what they write on page 5. Now, other literary critics such as Sherry Descartes, her use of the term comes closest to the context that I am using it in Nabarun's novel. So Descartes' essay in the above volume points to the socio-ecological crisis brought over by extractive capitalism in the peripheries of the world. She also reminds in another essay that the eco-Gothic form offers a powerful method of yoking cote and longitude, small, short, and long, sort of long-form history, long-term history, in which longer histories outside the capacity for memory of individual human protagonists manifest as apparitions that disturb the present. So, in a sense, that eco-Gothic, the ecological Gothic, has, of course, those supernatural ambience that sort of somewhere between natural and the supernatural, something that gives birth to magical realism to some extent as a form as well. But at the same time, unlike in magical realism of the Gothic, ecology is a very significant part in some of these writings. And you can read, of course, an eco-Gothic reading of something that is happening in the 17th or 18th century, also something that is happening very much in the next new millennium, where ecological and the climate come very much at the forefront. So what she says, Sherry, again, that what happens is in these novels or in these sort of literary works, we see a moment of what she calls teleesthesia. That is a moment that is able to reveal the periodicity of different moments of history. That is the mythological or the native cultural belief systems alongside or mostly to do with that, and sort of in a more magical realist manner, an uncritical sort of belief in or uncritical engagement with that the narrator doesn't want to critique some of the belief systems, which come as a form of resistance to what she says, what she calls imperial cultures of governance. So eco-Gothic, let me get to the second part of the talk. Eco-Gothic, and this will be slow, like much quicker than the other one, because I wanted to set the context to you so that you are also able to think of some other examples if you think about in this way. So eco-Gothic for me is one of those figurative shapes that Rob Nixon talks about that could give form to a formless violence that happened way back somewhere, and the impacts are coming to us right now. So what happens this is the second part in Nabarun's novel, Khelnanagar. So Nabarun Bhattacharya, many of you may know, is the son of Mahashweta Devi and Bijan Bhattacharya, both very noted literary writers and activists. And Nabarun also is mostly known as a dissident writer, left radical writer, and he's known for his novel Harvard and his another novel Kangal Malshat, What Cry of the Beggars, and then of course the Fataru stories. I don't want to go into Nabarun's sort of literary biography here, of course, because of time, and there are plenty of materials outside on available online about Nabarun, also in English. So if readers beyond Bengal are interested. So what happens is, in a sense that Nabarun's most dominant way of literary critique of a particular condition has been through either mockery or through using, let's say, supernatural aspects, which absolutely not only amaze us but frighten us, like the phantoms which can fly and attack people from a height. People, bourgeois people. That is a very strong class situation in Nabarun. And at the same time, these are situations of castes as well. So I'll not go into all of these nitty gritty right now. What happens in Khelnanagar, I wanted to say, is that this is way different, much more different, characteristically different, it seems, from Nabarun's other major works. Khelnanagar was written much later than, let's say, Herbert and Kangal Malsha, 2006. And this is a particular, I don't know about what is happening in an author's mind, of course, but the kind of prose that he uses here is very terse, almost shorn of any humor in that sense. So it shows that he's going through definitely undergoing in his writings some sort of an aesthetic change in order to talk about something which is actually, as I said throughout this lecture, difficult to represent. So what is happening in Khelnanagar? Very short, Khelnanagar is a novel. As you know, Khelnanagar means Toxicity. It's a novel about a particular, let's say, local area, a locality which is here as a Nogor or city. It's not like that. Of course, it's a sort of a tiny locality. But what is the crunch of the locality? There was a toy factory here, from where it gets the name Toy City. This toy factory was established by a businessman. Then suddenly it becomes very famous, starts sort of exporting toys and football, etc., to Europe, to the USA. So it gains a lot of focus, and because of that, it also has its own local population, based on most of them work in this sort of factory, or just because of a new habitation has grown out of it, of this particular factory, the strength of it. So what happens one day? The factory is on fire. The factory is absolutely collapsed, and plenty of people, so many people died, and the owner then leaves. He flees without giving any compensation or anything like that. And then what happens is, whoever was alive, either they left, or a very tiny number of people actually continue to live there. So what happens in this particular, so the novel begins with something we call prolepsis, or fast forward, that everybody has died. There was a bombing, everybody has died. From there we go back. It's a very short novel, more than, that's something with Nabarun. Novels are very short. They could be novellas, or they could be novels as well. So in this novel, we go back, and we know that this is the story, backstory, and that there are still some factions going on in people. There are conflicts, fights going on even within the tiny population that is alive. And we also get to know that people have started developing these bluish dabs on their skin. There are rashes. People are actually turning into blue, and then we get to know that there is a river. It's called Pari River, and then just beyond that, there is a huge mountain of toxic waste, and that sort of toxic, the drift of it, the liquid of it spills over into the river, and everything, all the fishes, etc., insects, everybody, every other form of ecosystem is gone. It's only the humans, and probably at the last phase before that. So what happens is, suddenly we see that somebody named as Wind Cheater arrives, and he tells them that he has found a source of pure fresh water. So very soon he gains trust from the people, and then what happens is, in the end, we get to know there was no source of water. Wind Cheater leaves with this note, is that we get to know that there have been bombs dropped on them. These were bombs being tested in a particular desert where they knew that there were nobody living. So they wanted to test these bombs. Maybe the state wanted to test. Nobody knows who is testing the bomb. There is a civil war going on, we know, and we never know where this Khelnanagar, this toy city, is located. The bombs are dropped, and the final words from Winchester would be that the point was to test how quickly they can kill people, and how many, what is the range of. So basically, these people do not have any so-called people rights, or these are like what Bale, a sociologist, calls sort of disposable peoples. So anyway, the point is, this is the story. So I just wanted to say very quickly of two textual strategies from Nabarun's novel, and you can always think about something else in comparison, or if you have read this novel, then of course what is happening inside. So what is happening here? There are plenty of Gothic imagery, etc., that I have written a paper on it, so I have sort of pointed those things out. But what is interesting here is that the sort of, as I said, the terse very reserved, laconic kind of style that he uses, almost on the verge of, let's say, scientific accuracy, or sort of rationalistic accuracy. At the same time, you find another sort of technique which is more like dialogic. I'll give you just two examples. So what happens is, this is my translation, how the novel begins. After the initial anxiety regarding the huge damage caused by two nuclear bombs, which were dropped in the northern and western sides of the country a couple of years ago, was over, scientists predicted that our climate would encounter remarkable changes. But while the bombs weighed 1 megaton each, the cloud of the nuclear winter wasn't too long and enduring. The first bomb had killed 9 million people, and the second had vanquished 8.93 million. Toy City faced a severe winter in 2004. The north side was open, so the chilly wind flew unhindered. It brushed past the city, pushed against the west mountain, and then left. The toxic and heavy bluish dust on top of the mountain was for a while disturbed by it, and then fell back in place again, quietly. So one can hardly miss the calm, scientific tone of the narrator and the report-like narration here. The description of the bombs and the exact number of killings, reported in objective solemnity, produce a chilling effect of how humans and places are turned into death worlds by the state. The commentary on the anxious repercussions in the scientific world regarding the bombs and the relative weaker actual after effects give us a clue into the deeply concerned yet sharply satiric mind of the narrator author. The abrupt shift to Toy City from the country holds clear the synecdochic element in the novel. That is something that I argue, that Toy City standing for the country as well as for the cities and regions in the global south. Now, the next fast-paced use of anthropomorphic imagery both questions the calmness of the narration above and the fear of desertification, something that is there throughout in some of the discussions that Nabarun does. Now, what happens is, think about the calmness of scientific narration, and sort of juxtapose it with this dialogic. Consider a very short dialogue between somebody known as Bamun, who also worked in the factory, and Winchester, who has just arrived. So Bamun says, "Who are you?" "Me? I'm no foreigner. I arrived today." "Name?" "I take whatever name people choose to give me." "Vagabond? You can call me that. Would you like to sit on the packing box?" Bamun sits. Winchester takes off his glasses, folds them. Now Winchester is saying that, "I have no weapon on me." "What?" "Your pocket is small, so I can see it." Bamun places a hand on his side pocket. "Keep it there, no problem, as long as you don't take it out. It can be a folded knife, but I assume it's rather a razor." Bamun changes the topic. "What book is that? I have not seen an English book for a long time." Winchester hands over the book. Bamun reads the cover. The cover is The Nuclear Winter. Bamun says, "What do you gain by reading this book now?" "There is no gain, but there is no loss either." This is how the conversation ends. Not ends, it goes on in my lecture. So what happens is, of course, he's reading about the nuclear winter, and he says, "What do you gain by reading this book now? That now we're living in some sort of a post-apocalyptic dystopia. Everything is over." And then the response is, "There is no gain, but there is no loss either." And we get to know later on why he was reading this book, because he is somebody who is used by the state, or some kind of an understanding of a state from a more established or a more powerful coterie to implement these sort of nuclear experiments. So the conversation here goes on with the narrator informing us then that Bamun tells Winchester the history of the city, which also forms part of the next section. Throughout the novel, conversations comprise either short and direct questions and or mystifying responses like above, reminding us of their uses in modernist European writings by such writers as Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, or Italo Calvino. Writing in the aftermath of a long war, the Second World War, these writers have used conversations in their work to conjure up an everyday world of miscommunication, fear, anxiety, and distrust. It is not surprising that post-war European writings have often been found surrealist or fabular in style, for their curious juxtaposition of the irreal and the real, or rather for their attempt to tease out the bizarrely extraordinary from within the banally ordinary. Indeed, this argument can be extended to writings from a decolonized global south, using magical realism or critical irrealism as a powerful tool to explore and challenge received notions of history and truth. So after a long narratorial exposition of plot description, these abrupt, matter-of-fact exchanges create an aura of puzzle and mystery. The aesthetic bewilderment is heightened in another section. Again, a tiny quote from where Winchester says, "I have found water." Listen to how he sort of conjures up the sentences. She says, somebody asks him, "You found water?" He says, "Yeah, water speaks, and water told me where it is." Somebody asks then, "What are you talking about? Water speaks." Now, this is what he says in quote. "Yes, water speaks. If water didn't speak, trees, animals, humans, nothing could ever exist. Water is a medium between the humans and the infinity. When you touch water, you don't know how many different things are also touching you in return. What do you think? Water is dead? Water doesn't have life? Water has life. Yes, water has life. This water here wants to get rid of poison, and it is doing so on its own. It is so close to you, yet you can't hear it speak. But I can." So this is where the quote ends. So since he discovers fresh water very soon, clearly his position as a visionary as well as a messiah within the Toxicity is firmly established. Now, what happens after this is that, again, more and more he will gain trust from the people until unless he hatches a plot where he will sort of put two sides into a conflict. There will be a problem, and finally there will be, of course, the bombing. In all of this, he will not be at all suspected. Now, what happens is that it goes on like this. Finally, I mean, just coming to the final part of it, just to make sure that this is not too long a lecture. Final part of it is that a huge amount of writing in this novel is about the scientific descriptions of maps and of this sort of book pages, excerpts coming out of books that were joined together. Everything talking about every document talking about nuclear disaster, talking about how to use that. And here I feel the Pokhran sort of tests are there in Nabarun's mind, but at the same time, think about the amount of warfare that is nowadays called biochemical kind of warfare. Think about the amount of, in general, sort of in a sort of civil wars that we are facing. So it could be anywhere. It could be anywhere. It could be any historical moment, especially from the 1920s onward. So, or the 1910s, only from the 20th century onward. I think the scale of it is so huge right now. So what happens, I come to the final part of this, of the novel and of the lecture as well. Just to quickly remind you, in the story, we also see that suddenly a vulture appears. Now this vulture, if nobody has any food, whatever food they had, they're sort of eating them, dried them, whatever rotten, and they're eating those things because nobody comes, nobody goes. Only truckloads of toxic materials come in this particular place and then leave. There is no connection whatsoever between this place, a peripheral distant region, the remote ground of toxicity, and what is happening in the main country. There is no electricity, there is no phone line, nothing is working, as if this entire habitation is rendered meaningless, useless, expendable, disposable, outside of humanity, so to say. So what happens is here, suddenly a vulture appears. And the vulture is actually, in the beginning, they were a bit tense that, okay, we are going to die, so the vultures are coming. But in the end, because of hunger, they want to kill the vulture. But at the same time, they realize that they can't eat a vulture. Humanity is still there. So after killing that, sort of what they do, they sort of hang it up on top of the sort of the toy factory. And later on, much later, we realize that the vulture was actually a remote controlled machine. It was so good and it was so well designed that it sort of deceived everyone's knowledge. And then the vulture is there and the eyes are actually cameras. So actually the entire population is being sort of monitored throughout by this, let's say, the drone or the drone-like creature. And this is when this population is going to be wiped out. The operation is called Operation Vulture. Now, once this everything is over, this sort of weird condition, and in this particular population, there are also supernatural things happening. There are like three old women who can foretell things. So what I wanted to say is that the key word I used before, teleesthesia, the periodicity of different moments of truth, be it today, people can ask with reason, be it somebody who can foretell a particular place which has gone completely wiped out, extinct, post-industrialist, post-apocalyptic. This is the kind of situation which automatically reminds you of certain things which are horror, certain things which are the toy factory described in a very gothical fashion. So it reminds you of what ecology has gone through in a period of civil war or biological warfare. That's where the teleesthesia or the ecogothic part comes in. But what is exactly so powerful about Nabarun is that he he can do it so well that in that in not very long novels and shorter novels, he can bring not only a plenty of emotion. Sometimes he seems so strong, so commanding over his use of language, the economy of it, the restraint of his in his writings. So uh, until now, Winchester was full of emotion, or at least could talk, could socialize. Finally, the final lines of Winchester, which comes like this, where he says his ulterior motive. Look at the sort of, again, the report like journalistic narration of studied objectivity. And I quote Winchester again. To cut short, my work was to set up business at a micro level and to make sure that things went well without anyone getting to see or know about it. Known as Enhanced Aviation Warhead, EAW, these weapons are completely dependent on nuclear fission. The heat and the sudden tremor resulting from the explosions remain limited to relatively smaller regions. But the huge wave that arises from the gamma and the neutron radioactive explosions can pierce through any hard shell or any thick cover and vanquish any kind of living organisms in a moment. They, however, do not damage natural resources or similar things. Unquote. Such an ending not only pieces together the nuclear references into a coherent post-apocalyptic narrative, but also amply points to a post-human toxic habitat of what Sherry Deckard again calls enduring nuclear that we live in right now. While there is resistance to this modernity from the margins, such as the factory workers, which made Winchester's task difficult, as he himself admits in the confession. They're protesting. Even there is a simulation of protest in that particular toy city, that habitation. People like Winchester are deployed so as to neutralize such resistances by playing the role of either efficient collaborators or pseudo-resistant voices from within. Classic capitalist strategy. Though Winchester's need human emotive appeal to be part of the vulnerable population groups, so successfully done by him in the narrative, they're not allowed human emotions in real life. This is clear when he ends the confession with the note that the corpses of the couple, Jisha and Kumar, who he established an emotional relationship with and promised to rescue, are sent wrapped in plastic to be studied in a lab. The caustic, subversive, and farcical aspects of the narration come full circle in the use of this deeply scientific, terse, and dehumanized prose that ensures that humanity has lost all humanist values in a world of extractive capitalism and permanent civil war. So, in a sense, so this is where my analysis of Nabarun's story ends, and this is where I feel like if we're going through this continuous sort of permanence of war and sort of radioactive, chemical, toxic sort of warfare, then this is going to bound to make us look like some of these characters that come out in Toy City. And this is the point that I wanted to make in this particular lecture in a larger sense, that how does literature, especially a novel form, represent something which is deeply harmful, but yet cannot be seen on a daily basis. Of course, Toy City can see, but we cannot see that what was happening in Toy City and impacting upon their lives. How can we, as writers and as critics, as everyday participants, can recognize some of this violence? And for me, in this particular lecture, I wanted to show that Nabarun does it in his Khelnanagar in a different way, in a way, I wouldn't say that different way, in a way that is different from the way he wrote about certain conditions in his other novels. Here in this novel, it seems that it is much more defeatist and pessimistic in his prose. His novels mostly end with hope, optimism, the resistance of the proletariat, or what, in other terms, however terms you use, urban poor or subaltern, the resistance of it, the hope of it, that we will come back. But here it ends with how things have been completely dehumanized. So this is somewhere down the line. This is where I feel like the change in writing, even the change in tone, this is not exactly what he does in another novel called Lubdhak, about dogs leaving the city of Calcutta because there is a giant meteorite going to fall or the city will be vanquished. Doesn't do that. He's much more humorous, much more happy in his writings. Here it seems there is a sense of an ending, so to say. So this is where I felt that literature, if we read their form and their style and how their structure is sort of built, then it can give us an entryway into understanding the difficulty or the challenge of understanding how a long form or a slow form of violence conditions our being, our everyday reality. So I'll stop here. And if you have any questions, etc., any comments, just let me know. Or you can also let me know later if you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya. I hope I'm audible. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Let me introduce you to myself because I had gone off camera for a little while to save up my internet. I'm Professor Aparajita Hajra, Head of the Department of English, SKP. Now,
Nice.
right at the beginning, I should thank you for that wonderful, wonderful lecture. It was well researched, well articulated, and it's kind of weird and uncanny in a sense, using the word uncanny because, just give me a second. Hi, Jyoti Bol. Unmute kora ache, tor kache unmute. Shorik can hear me. Oh. So, yeah, that was Jyoti saying, asking me to unmute my microphone.
I can't see you
So,
on the video.
Sorry. Can you see me on the video?
No, actually,
No.
it's my screen only.
Okay, I think that's.
I think Jyoti needs to.
I mean, I can't see anybody apart from my own screen, my own screen.
Jyoti, can you just bring us from invisibility to visibility, please? Aporia to clarity. I don't know whether Jyoti can hear me. Just bear with me a minute. Let me call
Okay.
her. He seems to be.
Just a minute. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you well and proper. You're all over the screen.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Like, I can only see.
You are all over the screen, Dada.
Yeah, Jyoti, we want you to put us all together so that we can see each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, looks good now.
That's better. That's better. Now can you see me, Professor?
Yes.
Yes. Now, right at the beginning, I should congratulate you. That was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. And like I was saying, that it's uncanny, using the word uncanny deliberately, that I should be the one to sum up your lecture because my specialization is also in Gothic.
Okay.
And I always keep telling my scholars that Gothic is one of those genres, which was probably never a very hot favorite in the main line of mainstream literature, but it has been probably the most enduring genre ever. It has been in and out of spotlight, but never off the screen. It has been there subliminally all the time. And I keep telling my scholars that this is one of the genres that is ever changing, ever evolving, and every time the Gothic takes a step towards evolving, it tends to become a little bit more formidable. Just imagine when 1764 saw Castle of Otranto. That was puerile. If you really compare it to the Gothicisms that we see all around us every day, that was kind of like monsters climbing out of screens, climbing out of helmets. You can deal with them. You can run away from them. But the Gothic, when it enters the mind, And like you said just now, when it enters the ecosystem, you just can't run from it.
Right.
So that makes you imprisoned, and this is how, the eco-gothic, I loved the lecture more so because it shows how the Gothic changes a perspective, towards transhumanism, post-humanism, and it's a kind of hybridity that leads you towards a new non-anthropocentric world, and the
Right.
tropes of the Gothic, the normal tropes of the Gothic that we are so familiar with, monstrosity, imprisonment, the uncanny, the unheimlich, repression, oppression, the location of those tropes, and as a result, the location of the trauma resultant from those tropes also makes a shift. Liminality
Right.
makes a shift. Like you were just now talking about soft violence and how violence, which you can't see, but it's there, very much there, and you can't run from it. This is even more formidable. This is a dystopia, which is kind of like very difficult to tackle. I remember in my youth, when I was as young as you are, I read your Joyce Carol Oates' Expensive People. And the first line of that book started with, I am a murderer. I am a child murderer, not a murderer who murders children, but I'm a murderer who is a child. And I kind of like shivered in my boots, getting goosebumps, thinking, gosh, this is terrible. But with the days passing by, the Gothic, and like you said, the eco-Gothic, it's changing, it's
Yeah.
shifting its liminality in such a fearful way that
Right.
things are becoming even more difficult to handle. Now, before, I don't want to take up screen space because I'm not the one at the center of attention today. But I couldn't help saying these words because I liked the lecture so much. Now, I think these are some questions coming in on WhatsApp, pinging in one by one. Let me see what they say. Just bear with
Dada, I
me.
have also one question, Dada. Sorry,
Yes.
Yes.
What I think that is it at all possible to read history as West within the bourgeois obsession with the now of modernity? And if
Uh,
so, is it possible to read the unproductive human rendered as the outcast of bourgeois modernity and also at the same time productivity, as in the novel? It is absolutely denying the historiography.
right.
So, like,
Right. So
how
do you want
will I
me
read the history in this context?
right? So do you want me to take one question at a time, or do you
Yes,
want
yes,
me
yes.
to? Okay.
These two questions. Yes, Dada. How to
Do you
read
want me to read
history
out
as a
the
West
questions,
within the
all of the questions, or do you want to?
I'll
no,
go
Didi.
one by one. No problem. As long as you have time, I'll go one by one. But I'll try to be brief with my responses so that
Yes, yes, yes.
we can manage to. So the first, I think these questions are interlinked. If I get you correctly, is that how to talk about a subject which is not, or which is outside the ambit of what is known as the bourgeois subject, or what is known as
Yes.
more something that we are going through, that some subject that can talk, that can make their presence known, subject that can be historicized. So my feeling is that in more cases, I mean, what Nabarun was doing here, I don't know their subjects which can be historicized. They're actually people who we might not even know. There are probably real people like that, real people going through difficulties of these nature, where their sort of skin, their sort of body is showing different kinds of repercussions, like the physical ailments, and maybe in a same situation. Navarone, whatever he writes, of course, in a writer, it's not all fictional, right? They do not sort of start inventing things out of nowhere. So my feeling is that these bodies, these people he talked about, Bamun, Winchester, etc., these people might not be the face of the, let's say, rather the more, as you said, the more bourgeois subject of history, but these people need to be talked about if we want to talk about the impact of certain things onto the wider population. And this is where I thought Navarun was making historicized subject out of them. We don't know exactly where and it is taking place, but we know that this is taking place at 2004 onward. We know certain days, certain numbers, and we also know that um, there are things going on in neighboring countries that he talks about. We know that truckloads, there are like some temporal historical specificity in this particular novel. So my feeling is that when you want to talk about something as wide and yet as invisible and palpable, even for us, the coronavirus, right? How do you talk about that? We talk about what we can talk about is the global lockdown. What we see is political heads talking about that, and we in social media or somewhere else or to our family members, we're just like sort of expressing our anger or frustration or sorrow. So that is what literature can show. Can it show the coronavirus moving? No. So this is where I think different writers will take different methods to deal, and this is what novel writing does, to bring completely dehistoricized subject into a historical framework from where we can start our discussions.
So in this context, I can say that can non-presentation be a possible ploy of representing the excess, or it's a possible mode of post-colonial representation? Do you think so? Non-presentation be a
Again, my
possible
brief
mode of
answer
post-colonial?
would be right. I got your point. My brief answer again would be that I believe in representation. I believe that struggling historical conditions, situations, and subjects need to be historicized and need to be brought into the frame through a framework, through a aesthetic framework, which need not to be in otherwise what we criticize or what we know as linear, sequential, or even straight. I mean, it's conventional. These things do not work in literature. We critics continue to term them linear, etc. But literature and time, they have their own aesthetic strategy. So my feeling is that even a non-presentation is a representation.
Yes. So I have
Okay,
another
so
question. Yes, Nivedita, you can ask.
should I start
No,
asking the questions? There are lots of questions pinging
Yes,
into my
yes,
mobile.
Yeah,
please.
we have a huge
This
number of
Yes.
questions.
these are
So
my
this one
personal
is
observation
from,
actually. Yes, yes.
Yeah, this one is from Shuporna Shengupto, who's a faculty in Jyoti Nivas College, Bangalore.
Right.
Shorit, I'm calling you Shorit, if you
Yes,
permit me to. Yes, thank you. What is the difference between eco-Gothic writing and dystopian narratives?
yeah, it's a great question. I'm just writing them down so that I remember. So thanks for the question. I think eco-Gothic, particularly in this particular novel, is inevitably dystopian. And dystopian, any kind of narrative which talks about, if we term them topo or topia means space, place. So the narrative will have to have a very strong atmospheric condition, like the ambience will be spatialized clearly. And in more cases than not, the dystopian narratives and utopian narratives, or even heterotopia, some people talk about, the way we term them is that there is post-apocalypse and how lives live. So in that sense, here in this particular novel, of course, this could be easily said dystopian, and I use the term. But for me, using the term eco-Gothic here, which means a couple of things which need to be brought into the fold. I think first of all, mm, not in every dystopian fiction form of writing, the Gothicism, or let's say the supernatural horror, is at the forefront. Here we know that in several episodes he talks about the sort of, not only the supernaturalization of life, but supernaturalism exists in their fear. There is every time it falls night, and they're like, they know that ghosts will come out, etc. Like, and sometimes they're seeing them. So there are things going on which are very much, we can say, even somebody can say magical realist, but where Nabarun again goes away from something like magical realist or dystopian is again the amount of focus that the ecological aspects here sort of are there in this particular novel. Ecology, remember, for me, my reading is that is an interaction between environment and humans. It is never about only environment or nature. Environment itself is an interaction between nature and non-nature elements. So that interaction is at the forefront of this writing. So these are the two things I could think about. But of course, I have myself used the term in the lecture that it is dystopian. So dystopian is probably its inherent characteristic.
Right. This is from Miss Pooja Kumari, Assistant Professor, YSNM College, Nilambar Pitambar University. She asks, the idea of the forest as deep, dark, and dangerous, that is Gothic, has an extensive history, but how it continues to resonate throughout contemporary popular culture. Why we fear the forest? Why do we fear the forest? That's what she means.
Yes, absolutely.
That's it.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for this question as well. I think, of course, like anything that we don't know, these are all my personal opinions. Anything that we don't know, we have a fear about. We know trees, but we don't know forests. Even in trees, we don't know a lot of the things. Whatever goes beyond our perception, our understanding of normalcy, is an aberration. And we are frightened of aberrations. We fear aberrations. Aberrations sort of disorient us. So here, I think in the Gothic, again, as you're talking about, forest as deep and forest as dangerous, this sort of an element came out. If you remember, the rise of the Gothic is very important in order to understand the rise of the metropolitan. The moment there is a capitalist imperialist rise, like the moment London becomes the city, the first city of empire, even if it's British Empire or Paris as in the French Empire, what happens is that the through the metropolitan, now whatever is not like the metropolitan, they are being talked about as provincial or regional. Now it is also coming into Indian writings in the 1920s and 30s onward in a different way, through Gandhi's invocation to rural life, etc. But whatever we don't understand, we have a tendency even today, as we go about our lives, to be afraid of it. And probably so it is the first thing that animals do, not only humans, animals do. So my feeling here is that the Gothic, the birth of the Gothic, is a fear of things we don't know in a world which is increasingly becoming wide and exposed to each other. This is the first time that people in the 17th and 18th centuries, 18th centuries in England, are knowing about how big Indian civilization was, or what is India, or what is happening elsewhere. They have just known, but they are now seeing images, etc. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the Gothic, the revival of the Gothic form, somewhere down the line has these fears of the unknown even today, because we don't know. Again, think about this question in this way: because we don't know whether the vaccine of the coronavirus could be found. We don't know actually what is happening, and this non-knowledge creates all the fear. How many of you are afraid of malaria, right? We are afraid of malaria, we're scared, but at the same time we know that there is vaccine, some sort of a relief. So here in this particular novel, I also think, because these are not everyday realities, that people will come and drop bombs, and there is a vulture which is seeing things, there is the life being entirely dominated by machines, and post-humanist values. The humans are sort of not only certain kinds of humans. Remember one thing: post-humanist would be that only certain kinds of humans have been wiped out or have been sort of put into stake, and not like all humans. People with wealth and power will do those things. So in the same way that we talk about climate change today. So my feeling in here again, answer would be that the rise of the Gothic has to be. Gothic is probably, or horror is probably, sort of so well connected with the rise of global capitalism, which is the predecessor of globalization. If you go into internal territories you don't understand about, what you will bring back alongside wealth is fear. So that's where Gothic becomes so so long term in writings. It comes back; it never goes out of fashion, so to say. Look at the popularity of fantasy writers today. Look at Harry Potter being read so widely. Where does it come from?
True. And Gothic is all about the uncanny. It's all about the unheimlich. And liminality is very important for the Gothic. The word border, as much as it is
Right,
important in the discourse of abjection, it's very important in the study of Gothic as well. And
right,
there are certain things that always reflect the border or reflect the transgression between normalcy, what we know as normalcy, because that is again a
right,
very tricky, dicey term, normalcy and abnormalness, permissive, permission, what is permitted and what is forbidden, what is dark, what is light, what I
Right.
know, what I don't know. So naturally, that probably is epitomized here. Right.
Right. Right.
This is a question from Maharsheta Goswami, pursuing master's course in English literature from Assam University, Silchar, Assam. You're getting questions from all over the place. Is there toxicity reflected through the hierarchical structures of the society in Nabarun Bhattacharya's writings?
Yeah.
If you want me to repeat the question.
Yeah. So it is toxicity represented through the hierarchical structures? Is it in society?
Structures of the society in Nabarun Bhattacharya's
Right. Right. Yes.
Bhattacharya's writings. Yes.
Right. So what I I like Nobarun a lot, and I have along with a colleague, my friend Orko Chattopadhyay, we brought out a collection of writings on Nobarun in 2015 in a journal that we co-edited called Shonglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry. Then Orko has gone on to co-edit a book on Nobarun, and then we are now editing a book on Nobarun coming out from Bloomsbury in July. So what is happening is that I have read Nobarun a different way, and through whatever I have read, I mean, of course, the readings are going to be different. My point is, in all these readings that I've done for these books or for these writings or for myself, I see there's hierarchy and toxicity are so deeply integral to Nobarun's writings. Like, if they're talking about the urban poor, people who do not have rights in the same sense that civil society does, something that Partho Chatterjee, the political scientist, calls political society, something people who do not have rights, who do not have, but who also are a very strong population, very important population for electoral politics, rights in the same way that others hold. So for me, I think that because of this particular structure that Nobarun wants to explore in his writings, toxicity is there in the way that you would take it, like the social relations. There are people, like slangs are used, and then do not think about political correctness. If you read Nobarun is not, and of course a lot of the criticism is coming because Nobarun did not publish with established press for a long time throughout his entire career, so to say. It's only later that established Bengali presses, the more popular ones, are publishing Nobarun. He published mostly and widely in little magazines, and there you don't have a wider audience, and you don't have all these moralities that he criticizes as Victorian morality in Kangal Malchat will have to be present. So what happens is that he shows slices of society in a very aesthetically sophisticated way that are very real in everyday life. So those social hierarchical relations with all their toxicity are present. But at the same time, it is to remember that Nobarun's representation of women is particularly, or about caste, about certain use of language, particularly, are not always something which is beyond critique. And of course, everybody is subject to critique, but there has been already criticism of Nobarun's representation of women. So this particular thing, notwithstanding that every writer is open to criticism, the way that we interpret, but at the same time, I feel that if you are focusing upon those particular stratum of society, that particular stratum of society that is historically deprived, toxicity becomes the way through which you speak, even if it is not toxic drift in the more chemical sense.
Okay. Now there is this question from Antara Mukherjee. She teaches in Chandanagar College. She asks, do you think
Right.
that as a writer, Nobarun combined voyeuristic pleasure with human unconscious for default nuclear toxic, the wild image of vulture, as an instrument of surveillance?
Right. If I get the question correctly, it's about Nobarun's like whatever he is doing is Nobarun's voyeuristic pleasure, be it the surveillance part or be it the novel part. Is it right? Could you just once repeat the question?
Yeah, just give me a second. The question is, do you think that as a writer, Nobarun combined voyeuristic pleasure with human unconscious for
Right.
default nuclear toxic, the wild image
Right.
of
I got it.
vulture as an instrument of surveillance?
Right. Yes. Thank you. Again, great question. I feel I'm not always I mean, like, whatever I say, as I said in the beginning, these are all personal opinions. A writer is always subject to different kinds of criticisms and viewpoints. My understanding is that a writer is, would it be wrong to say that every writer is a voyeur? Otherwise, how would you go into those relationships and expose them to public in literary style? So, whether he is deriving a pleasure of a different kind, which we do not have the substation of aesthetic to, like if it is aesthetic or not, is also subjective to value, subjective to our own opinions. My understanding would be, if I, as I have been doing this, my opinion would be that Nabarun uses surveillance, and you were right that the vulture is of course a more, everything is surveilled in this particular, it's a huge panorama of surveillance, the paranoia, or rather what somebody else would call, sometimes we use the word Foucauldian sense or Benthamite sense, panopticon. Everything has been sort of monitored. Now, what is there is that the vulture was, it could be anything. If you want to surveil, why do you send a vulture? It could be just a drone or something else, like a bird sitting somewhere. The vulture gives them the sense that they are human, they are mortal, they will die, and that is precisely why the vulture is coming. The vulture comes when vulture sense that humans or animals will die and they can feed on the carcass or the corpses. So that's the point. So that these reminds them temporarily that they're humans, they're mortal, they're not going to, or probably also the fear that they're going to probably die very soon. Vultures can sense it. So this is where I thought that Novaron, by using the vulture, he tries to humanize the situation, but at the same time, by later telling us that this vulture is actually a machine with eyes that can see like a camera, he reminds us how far we have gone. How far we have gone that apparently humanized objects are actually being used to, in a machinistic manner, surveil us, to sort of later on take us, very in a well manner fashion, take us to our extinction. So in that way, I think the voyeuristic pleasure and human unconscious that you combine, that you went together, I think voyeuristic pleasure comes from that human sort of unconscious to exposed to that, especially for a writer, so much so. But today, the society we live in and the way that our lives are monitored and surveilled, it just shows, maybe because of the logic of security, and you don't know whether to resist that, to protest to that. Sometimes there are temporary protests, but this is a way to also surveil over everybody's private life. And this is where I believe your beliefs, your emotions, your assumptions, this is where a more post-human order comes in. And Nobarun does that. But he also reminds us that humans are not dying. Humans are actually doing that. And people like Winchester will be deployed to these places to make sure that they could easily be obliterated with a nuclear warfare. Why would they send Winchester? It is to convince them that there is hope, and with that hope they die. So that's where Novarun, I think, makes it even more difficult and more complex for many of us.
Okay, so it was a very enriching session, and I thank Dr. Shorit Bhattacharya for being kind enough to find out time and speak about his experience of reading Nabarun Bhattacharya. And it was really very interesting. I was going through the questions. We have lots and lots of more questions, but we will be forwarding them to you as we don't have enough time at present.
Right.
And I would like to thank I would like to thank the presenters today. I would like to thank Professor Krishna Sen for, in spite of going through a huge difficulty, she has sent us her paper. And I would like to thank the other presenters. Shori, thank you. And of course, our university authorities, the Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Dipak Kumar Kar, who had given us permission for this, our registrar, Sir, who was there to encourage us. Our Dean Madam, Professor Shonali Mukherjee, was there yesterday. And of course, the participants. Without them, you are really making us very, very happy. Yesterday's viewing ended up at somewhere around 2,900. That made us really happy and proud. And today also we can see that number of people have come in to join this live session. And of course,